Player Will.
Welcome back, Visions fans. Ready Player Will here. Today's kind of a little bit of a think piece where I want to ask the question, is Missile dead in War of the Visions? Let me set the stage a little bit for why I came to this question. I'm in the middle of doing my Irvine character review, looking at the stats, looking at his kit, and I'll be honest, spoiler, it's a little pessimistic. And as I'm kind of thinking through this, it dawned on me it's not really anything that is wrong with Irvine in particular. It's really more the state of Missile in War of the Visions that I had an issue with in terms of his potential impact and where he fits into the game, where he fits into the future. That I thought this would be an appropriate video to just kind of talk things out, talk about some things I'm thinking, maybe give some insights that might make sense when I do that review, when people pull it, maybe when they try to test missile units. But let's jump into things for now. So let's talk a little bit about historically where missiles' strengths were, what those builds typically were confined to, and there typically was a recurring theme between many of those missile units through the life of the game. Number one, they were either high damage or high utility, and for a long time they were the kings and queens of utility, where they had multiple effects on certain abilities, and because they had range, they could get those debuffs and of things of the sort out early in the fight to kind of get a head start. Or you had characters who were kind of like nukers in their damage, and this not necessarily was a strong thing. Characters like Luartha and Lucia were that kind of build where they were more of an emphasis on just damage as opposed to the utility. And you usually had some kind of trade-off between the two. It wasn't until Eliza and Elia came out that Gumi gave them both. It was high damage and high utility. It kind of broke the game for a little while, and they obviously set the bar for many reasons. Now, another thing is they are typically much higher on the critical hit rate, and the general idea is that, their overall modifiers and many abilities aren't typically as high as some other units, and they make up for that by having higher crit rate, which means you get the crit rate damage modifier. There's a little more burst to their attacks compared to some other units, but that's obviously changed a little bit over time too with characters and their crit rate and that whole conversation. But they also had above average agility typically, where the general concept was sure, they're not going to nuke you out of the sky, but between the extra crit damage, the extra turn order, they're going to chip away you a lot faster than some other units do. And so it's kind of those things, it's maybe not these devastatingly large attacks, but you just get more smaller attacks and you just win the fight from that perspective, particularly as you have the range advantage and characters get closer to you. They also typically did have very high accuracy and access to 100% hit, where being high critical rate units, they would have very high dexterity levels, and we're at the point where that's a little bit less true nowadays because dexterity is so high amongst many units that missile units exceptionally high dexterity rate isn't necessarily accuracy driven, it's more crit rate driven, but that's still an attribute that many of them had a build for. They were also obviously relatively squishy compared to other units, where their health pools obviously weren't as large as frontline damage dealers, where they could get potentially one hit or two hit, and they still do. And that's the trade-off for some of this extra, damage uptime per se. But they also typically had above average AP management, where a lot of them would have different forms of AP cost reductions on things, maybe some cheaper abilities relative to others. But missile units, by and large, were kind of in this ballpark, with the idea being longer uptime for some less devastating attacks and add some utility to it. There was more of this X factor to them. Now, there is kind of an in-game admission of this, and I approach this through the perspective of reincarnation stats. Now, this isn't a conversation about whether you should or shouldn't, or whether it's good or not. This is looking purely at the stats from Gumi's perspective when they balance the different classes, right? And I talked about this in my, should you reincarnate your supports videos, but just kind of talking through this again to kind of hammer home the point I was just saying. Physical melee DPS, one of their big things here for strengths that Gumi has given them in reincarnation, is much higher attack stats. That's the same with magical DPS. They get 180 attack in magic, which is essentially the highest you can get. They also emphasize pure crit rate here at 20%. That's also the highest you can get. When you then start to compare the ranged DPS, which is what we're talking about with the missile units, big drop here in the HP that they give them. These reincarnations only give very little HP relative to the other classes, and that kind of fits into that squishier build concept. They do emphasize some extra dexterity, which, as I mentioned, is more correlated to crit rate and a little bit to accuracy, but 14 dexterity is not making or breaking your accuracy. But the actual accuracy stat itself, they do have 4% more than the others, and it's not terribly material, but it's a little more material. But you can tell just by how Gumi decided to allocate these stats that there is this sort of concept of what they want to do, and the attack stats here are lower. It's only 126 attack or magic as compared to the 180. And as you continue to go down here, evasion units typically have equal to or more HP given than the ranged units. And then the tanks and supports, obviously, we know much about these stats as well. But again, when you're comparing things like the HP levels when you're comparing things like the attack stats they give, the dexterity, the accuracy. Missile units has this sort of like conceptual build that Gumi runs with and kind of stays within. Now, let's just talk briefly about what I consider a missile-only auto PvP tier list. And that's not the point of this video to talk about tier stuff. It's about setting the bar of where like the best missile units are compared to the others to kind of get an idea. And I'm going to wrap this up with a more general statement on it. But to me, like Eliza, Elia, and Summer Jaden are still the S tier potential of missile units, where they bring both damage and utility, and the types they bring are really impactful, and they do their jobs exceptionally well. Now, just a step below them, I do think is C-Tia and regular Jaden, similar things in their own respect. The B tier for me is the new Summer Lilith with that 140 upgrade specifically, without that different character. Charisse is there and Rugia is there. Now they're a little more niche in their application overall. The C tier units are Fred, Barrett, and Lucia, where pretty average missile units, and the rest of them, in my opinion, are all, way below what these S and A tier units offer, where they are way more squishy or not nearly as much damage or not nearly as good utility, or there's AI problems. But this is the general concept I wanted to work with in terms of where the bar is for the best missile units at the moment. And if you were to take these missile units and compare them to the general top damage dealers in the game, it's still not even close. There's a huge gap between the S tier missile units and the like actual S tier DPS units. Sephiroth, Bradley, Perrine, Ed, Elia. To a degree, even Bart's I know is debatable in that category, depending upon where you play. But right now, there is a sizable gap between the actual damage dealers and where these missile units fall in, and all of these missile units, respectively, suffer relative to where the top dealing damage units are in the game. But let's talk about what changed for them. So there's a whole bunch of balance-related things that changed. And number one, the maps aren't as long as of late, and missile units are very boom or bust on the extra range they can potentially get on a map, or the topography of the map, where if it funnels people into certain places, if you're not allowed to walk straight across the battlefield. This was a big advantage for missile units for a long time, and a lot of you can probably recall a few maps that were like canyons from each other, where you would have missile units stand on top of this canyon and people were forced to walk around. When's the last time you saw a map like that? It's been months, if not a year plus. So the map's number one, and this is the only weapon type in the game that really has a high correlation to the map. The other four damage types, slash, pierce, magic, strike, the map doesn't necessarily matter as much for them, but missile is very much skewed by it. Now the second thing is, Eliza and Elia drove a fair amount of missile resistance power creep into units in the game, where all of a sudden you were seeing more missile resistance than average. They were giving bumps to certain things like the defense bracer in terms of missile resistance. They have a vision card that was very powerful for them, that was not only missile attack but missile resistance penetration on the second one. So they drove a fair amount of power creep in the missiles category that none of the other units really had access to, other than Summer Jaden, who does technically have a missile resistance penetration card. Now, the other thing is, 3rd anniversary, we're seeing massive bumps in unit and AoE res across almost everybody in the game. So the former damage upside that many of these characters have is vastly diminished because there's so much impenetratable other resistance, in addition to way higher defense, way higher missile res potential, and what they have on vision cards and things of that nature. So the 3rd anniversary has completely changed the damage mitigation portion of that. And other DPS have blended into their territory of what was formerly their strengths. Almost all damage dealers post 3rd anniversary have good AP management. This is not a strategic advantage to missile units anymore. The fast turn order, there are so many units right now that hit 120 plus in their agility that missile units can't compete with. That no, not only these brawlers just have higher modifiers and better penetrations and better imperils, they are also just as fast. And many have near enough range where missile units, if you consider range +1 or range +2, they might have like an extra square 2 advantage on them, but a lot of other damage dealers here, now with the select 2, diamonds as well, way more range versatility for a lot of these damage dealers. And these new DPS we're getting are both damage and utility. There's so many characters now that have like 1 or 2 debilitating debuffs or imperils or things on their attacks, and way more diamond based attacks, that the melee damage dealers are basically doing the same job as the missile units once were. So there's been a drastic change in how Gumi's approached that. And then finally, on the top end of the game, I know this doesn't apply for everybody, but the missile reincarnation incarnations simply aren't worth it compared to the other units. As we saw, it's a paltry amount of HP, negligible amount of dexterity. They're not even the leaders of the crit rate in their category. It's a middling amount of attack or magic they get. So in terms of where that gap ends up being at the top end of the game, which typically does kind of drive the meta for Gumi in the game, missile units are definitely a step behind all the others, so they don't get nearly the amount of love, if any, that they do. So there's a bunch that has changed balance-wise for them. And so the thing that I'm considering now is when I look at a character like Irvine, where does he fit into missile and like the broad skate of the game? One of the downsides, just kind of alluding to what I'm going to think about here, Irvine is a direct line of sight attacker only. He does tend to prioritize more damage than he does utility. And when I think about conceptually, like what other missile units has that formula worked for, it's really these characters more toward the bottom of the tier list, where characters that have direct line of sight only do have problems. They're typically a little more short range. The durability hasn't held up over time, that if they have to get a little bit closer or put themselves in harm's range, they don't have the durability to stand there. But at least some of these characters like Jaden and Summer Jaden, which do have direct line of sight abilities, they also have arcing shots, which is the difference between gun units and bow units, where at least a bow unit can stand from afar and hit over pieces of land or teammates and whatnot, and Irvine simply kind of isn't in there. So I'm not going to talk too much about him, but that's one of the problems I was having when talking about like the conceptualness of this. So what would I do personally? This is kind of to like put the cherry on top of what I think it would take, because I do think missile is effectively like kind of dead at the moment. It's exceptionally niche. Only a few select characters can actually work in it, and there's a couple of things I think I would do to try to re-bring back their brand, if you will. And the first thing is I would put a higher emphasis on missile mods as compared to the other damage types, and I specifically mean things like vision cards, where if a new vision card comes out, if people are getting slash attack 35, well, the missile unit should get like missile attack 42 or 45. They should naturally have that advantage of the missile mods if Gumi's going to not allow them the same levels of innate penetration and things of that sort. I also think one of the things they should do is put way more impact on the first turn buff. And to me, this would solve that map problem right now, where if you have a missile unit who can only buff once and then they're already in the fight, that first buff needs to be exceptional. And they did do this with Ice Alaya, where her buff, it's 30 ice attack, it's 40 missile res pen, it's decrease AP consumption of 33% until she receives 2 hits, which she's dead after 2 hits anyway, so that's basically forever. And it's an increased range of 1 for the same thing until 2 hits are received. But yeah, you got 4 different attributes on that. That's a great ability and a huge diamond AoE that most other missile units don't have, and those that don't have that I think are going to just not do as well comparatively. I would put more move and jump affecting utility either in their own passives or their attacks, not only for themselves but for the enemies. Characters like Alaya and Rugia have the move -1, very important for them staying on the back line and not keeping up. Forever, missile units needed to have the producer's bow tie on them to emulate that and keeping their distance. But if you're going to focus a character on range in that whole game, you need to allow more access to move -1 for your missile units, or for them to be able to skew enemy movement to slow down how quickly they can cross the battlefield as well. I think it's a big part of that's missing at the moment. I would also do more status ailment emphasis, where if you are going to throw the X factor into things, if the idea is that you want to even the playing field by the time the melee units get to you, things like poison, sleep, frostbite, blind, immobilize, disable, all would do exceptionally good things for throwing off the impact that a lot of these new melee DPS have. And then finally, more of like these X factor counter abilities, which we've seen lots of counter abilities get huge power creep 3rd anniversary, that missile units should have some very special counter abilities that there is counterplay for that. You can do reaction block rate and make it useless. There is counterplay, so it's not a broken mechanic, but they should have something very special for themselves for this counter ability that gives them that X factor to still potentially do their job. But I am relatively pessimistic about missile for the foreseeable future in global, particularly when you consider the fact that mono element is moving away and we're getting more job oriented vision cards and whatnot. Their vision cards are fine. They're not exceptional. We're still missing the Melnia one, which is the absolute pinnacle must-have for those units. But even then, there's been a little bit of confusion on them releasing job-based vision cards that are bow units versus gun units, and I'm grouping them here in this, thought process. But Gumi has separated them on some of the vision cards too, which obviously makes it tough that you can't use 2 missile units together on the same vision card, despite the fact that they are missile scaling. They just have different classes. That's not the case for Pierce, nor is it the case for Strike. If you're a Pierce unit, you're a Spear wielder. You're on all the Spear cards. If you're a Strike unit, you're on a Fist wielding unit. You're on all the Fist cards. And I think Missile should be in that category as like one entity. If you're a Missile unit, you should be on all the Missile cards. I get they split up Magic and Sword because there's a lot of variety in those two types of units. But Missile, I don't think there is, and I don't think there should be. So I think there's already some mistakes there from the job-based vision card allocation. But that's my soapbox in a nutshell. Hopefully just a talking point and some context for when you think about these units. And as we do start to get some more Missile units here with Irvine this week, and I'm sure Melnia, I mean, I guess maybe like in a month and a half. Who knows at this point, really. But it's a tough spot to be in at the moment. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll talk to you all soon.